So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Isabel Ramos. I'm part of the executive committee of PARSUC. And as you know, you have been attending this for quite some time. You know where this is going. So for those that don't know about us and are joining our events for the first time, PARSUC is a Portuguese association of researchers and students in the United Kingdom, an independent and non-profit association without political affiliation, which aims to represent the interests of Portuguese researchers and students in the UK. We function as a network to promote the research by the PARSUC members and to bring together our community and researchers in Portugal and in Portuguese-speaking countries. I want to welcome all of you and thank you for registering for this ENVOLVE training program, a partnership between PARSUC and Fundação Carlos Gulbenkian. I want to let everyone know that the webinar is being recorded for educational purposes. So if you don't feel comfortable with the camera on, please feel free to switch that off. I also would like to ask you to fill in the feedback form, which will be sent to you within the next few days. And this really helps us with future training sessions. So this is the 6th session on the ENVOLVE training program, and we will hear about publishing. And the session today will include a presentation by Dr. Marcia Costa, Senior Editor at Lancet Oncology, and Dr. Rafal Marszalek, Deputy Editor, Scientific Reports, Nature. So I would like this to be as interactive as possible, as you know, so if you have any question, please feel free to use the chat. Publishing research results is crucial for progressing science and advancing the researcher's career. And reporting in science must be factual, concise, and accurate, and importantly, must clearly describe how the work presented contributes to the field. In this session, we will aim to cover the essential aspects of high impact factor journals are looking for when assessing their submissions, the common barriers for publication, and the importance of transparency in science publishing. I would like to perhaps give 5 to 10 minutes to Marcia and Rafal to introduce yourselves, and then we can start the presentations.
Thank you, Isabel. First of all, thank you for the invitation. And once again, congratulations to Isabel from PARSUC and obviously from the Foundation Carlos Gulbenkian, because you guys have been doing a great work with this program. And it's great to see it going. I started my career as well as a PhD student. I did research in cancer for 4 or 5 years, and my PhD was actually in basic science. So I was doing preclinical work in mice, and I was studying ultrasound and radiation for treating head and neck tumors. And then after my PhD, I did a short postdoc in immunotherapy using ultrasound as well, again in mice. And then I started to decide that it wasn't the career option I would like to pursue. For several reasons, professional and also personal reasons. So when I looked at other careers, publishing seemed to be one of the things that aligned most with my interests, because it will allow me to still read about cancer and study about cancer, but not doing the research part, but still being involved in that world that obviously has been my passion for the past decade. So this opportunity came up at the Lancet. So I started as an assistant editor, and a lot of my work was editing, so proper grammar, data checking, etc. And then over time, I moved on to a peer review position. So basically, these days in my day-to-day basis, I receive papers, I assess the paper, and if I think it's strong enough to be published at the Lancet Oncology, I then send it out to peer review. And so that's a panel of experts. Generally, we'll have 3 clinical reviewers and 1 statistical reviewer that will look at the paper and say to us if it's technically sound and if it's novel enough to be published, because obviously it's always good to have an expert opinion about the impact it can have in the field. And I must confess, it has been an amazing experience, because it becomes very clear the impact that research has in society. And I think in a lot of my work in the lab, I did not have these vision of where the field was going, or oncology as an overall field, where it was going, how can we help shaping it, and not only in terms of science, but how can we support, for example, women in research, etc. And so it has been a great experience. I don't want to speak too much. I'll just present a few slides, because I think what we're trying to assess is, how do I get published, etc. And I'm not sure how many of you will actually be doing clinical research, so actually running clinical trials.
I'm not sure about clinical trials, but there is lots of kind of translational science being done by the
yes.
researchers.
Yeah. So when we think about what do we generally publish, and I'm sure Rafal will say roughly the same thing. So obviously we want what is novel, and at the Lancet specifically, because it's a very clinical focused journal, we want what can change clinical practice. So our papers will have a panel dedicated to, okay, you've done a great trial, but how novel is it, and how will this affect the way we've been treating our patients so far? It happens as well if we have the first trial of the nature, for example, if we have a new drug, we would like to publish this sort of thing. And or the last one, so the one that kills the debate. Sometimes that's going on for many years in the field. Unlike what many people think, we do publish negative results, and we do like to publish this because sometimes it just avoids other patients being treated with something that clearly is not working. So we do like, if it's an important trial, even if it's negative, we publish several of those. And generally we like topics that they are not just for one region, even though we will have the occasional paper for one specific region, but generally we're looking for papers that can change clinical practice worldwide. So this is the sort of thing we will be looking for. Common barriers to publication, things like lack of novelty, and sometimes this is unfortunate. I know sometimes studies in general, clinical trials take a while, and by the time people are ready to publish, it's not novel anymore. But generally, this is one of the common barriers. If technically the paper is not sound, as I've mentioned, we always have statistical reviewers, we have clinicals looking at the paper to make sure the analyses are done correctly. If the objectives are not defined, the Me Too syndrome, so, 5 other groups have shown this, we are showing this as well. And another important bit is if the presentation is very poor, or if we cannot understand the language that is being used. So we always advise, obviously we receive papers from, all countries in the world. So just try to make sure that if the person writing maybe is not as skilled with languages, and maybe look for an editor that can look at it, because otherwise we receive the paper and we can't understand really what we are reading. Now, this is a bit specific, again, for clinical papers. It's always important to stick to the reporting standards. And it needs to be very clear, what the objectives were, and the reporting has very standard points, but I'm not going to go in many detail with this for this presentation. We can discuss it afterwards if you guys might think it's relevant. And then obviously the clinical trial must be registered before, because it allows for transparency. And I think transparency is my last point. And I think in a lot of clinical practice, there has been issues with people not reporting their conflicts of interest properly. So this needs to be done. Now, we are also very keen on having at least 2 academic authors that actually check the raw data, because we had issues in the past with fraudulent data that did not exist. And we are very keen on data sharing as well. And obviously very careful with plagiarism, and to make sure this is novel work and not that someone else did. So I think I'm going to stop here, and then obviously I'll take any questions you guys might have.
Thank you. Thanks, Marcia. Perhaps we can give 5 to 10 minutes to Rafal to also give us a bit of background on yourself, your career journey, and then where you are now.
Thank you for inviting me to that seminar as well. And most of you guys have seen quite a few of those, but I hope you'll be lenient with us, because I didn't know what the format exactly is going to look like. So I'm completely unprepared for what might actually come after the presentations. I've been in publishing for about 10 years now. Similar to Marcia, I essentially moved into publishing pretty much immediately after my PhD. My background is in sort of biological and analytical chemistry, and particularly in proteomics. My first role, sort of editorial role, was with Genome Biology, which is a sort of a selective genomics journal from Biomed Central, which is currently part of Springer Nature, a company for which I still work, just in different capacity. I was manuscript handling editor there, so essentially responsible for selection of papers for peer review and sort of administering peer review process, all the things that I think Marcia is doing in her current role. About 5 years ago, I moved over to Scientific Reports, which is a very different type of journal. As part of the Nature portfolio, it is a common misconception that it's Nature. It isn't Nature. It's an independent journal that is set up very differently. It's a very different beast to a lot of journals as well, in that it's really large volume, large sort of very broad scope publication, and that sort of brings certain differences in how it is sort of set up and managed. And I have a single slide about the journal, so if I can just check whether this is something I can do. So can you guys see that slide?
Yeah.
Because that sort of setup changed for me a bit. That's just so that you don't have to stare at my face as I keep talking about the journal. But don't be sort of distracted by all the sort of information. It's just essentially a fact sheet that we sort of share, and I'm happy to share it after the meeting anyway. About the journal, slightly out of date because a lot of the data is from about a year and a half ago, but most of it kind of is still relevant. So as I said, we're a very, very large journal. We publish the last, I would say, 5 years on average, probably over 20,000 papers a year. That's about 80 to 100 papers every day published across the full scope of the journal, which is, stems essentially currently from sort of social sciences, cognitive psychology, for life sciences, clinical sciences, sort of physical sciences, all the way to engineering. So we do consider very sort of varied type of content. As you can imagine, given the numbers of papers we publish, we don't actually have in-house team of editors who handle those papers. We have editorial board of academic editors, which is currently over 10,000 people strong, because that's essentially the number of people you need to be able to handle and process that volume of papers efficiently. And the sort of underlying sort of philosophy of the journal is one of sort of inclusivity and I would say non-selectivity. So I think that's the big difference between Scientific Reports and the Nature itself, but also a lot of journals with Nature in the title, and similarly the Lancet portfolio as well. Those are all journals that are selective in how they choose papers to publish, in terms of looking at, in particular, what the novelty is, what the advances, what maybe perceived significance of the findings is. We don't use those sort of what we refer to as perceived or subjective criteria as a criterion for publication. And the rationale there is that the grand majority of research that's done in the world is incremental. Is not going to be cutting edge, or it's not going to be a breakthrough or a paradigm shift. If every piece of research that we produce was paradigm shifting, we'd be not doing anything else all the time apart from shifting paradigms. We honestly wouldn't have time for anything else in the world. But it's not the case, obviously, and that doesn't mean that the research is done and that's maybe not as attention grabbing, is not important. And so what we try to do is essentially to offer a place for those papers and those studies to get published. So something that maybe is of slightly less relevance, if it's a clinical paper that's relevant internationally, Lancet will be quite happy to publish. But things that are sort of maybe a bit more of regional relevance will not necessarily be interesting for selective journals. We'd still be happy to publish those as long as they are scientifically valid. So I think the slide that Marcia had about the reasons why research isn't published, I think those reasons sort of, I would say they fall into two categories really, and some of them are really about whether research is well done, whether it's valid, whether the research questions are original, and the methods that you choose to sort of employ are correct and appropriate for the research question, whether the analyses are technically well done and correct, and then at the end, whatever interpretation of the data that you present or conclusion that you draw, they're actually supported by the data you have, or the data that's out there as well in the literature. So that's essentially what we would refer to as essentially confirming that science is sound in the paper. And the other set of sort of those sort of reasons why papers maybe fail in sort of being published in more selective journals are slightly more subjective. So those are the ones where we sort of step in and say, if you'd like to publish your paper and, maybe not necessarily keep ping-ponging between a lot of journals, which might be selective, and you just might end up spending more time going between the journals until you find the right one than you spend doing research, then you can try a journal that's not selective. There aren't that many journals like that. There are some that you are probably familiar with. Our biggest competitor is obviously PLOS ONE. The BMC series of titles, which are BMC. I'm trying to think of a good example that's well known. I don't know what sort of fields you guys work in, but I don't know, like BMC Genomics, for example, or BMC. I think there's several clinical titles there. BMC Pediatrics, or I think BMC Cancer. Those are all journals that are based on similar principles. So they will look essentially at, is there an original contribution, without actually going into how much of a contribution the paper is, and then is the paper robust scientifically. And so I'm not trying to position myself as a sort of opposition to Marcia here. I just want to. I think that those are two very compatible ways of looking at publication of papers, that both of which are needed. I think there is, definitely space for journals that highlight those results that are really important and groundbreaking, and especially in clinical sciences where they might have a big impact on clinical practice. The visibility that you get by publishing in selective journal is something that, I think shouldn't be overlooked. And it's not something that we could offer to the same degree in the journal that publishes 100 papers a day, obviously. That being said, there is all this other research that also needs to be published. Because if you don't, you essentially, you hide the data in the drawer, and just by the virtue of doing that might affect, your future research, but also what other people do. I mean, this is why we also always talk about publication of negative results. The point is that people don't go and redo the same study over and over again in different settings because nobody could have been bothered or had, a good publishing strategy to publish that, so that then people know this is not working, we can move on to something new and not waste any more money and time and effort. Right. I think I'm going to finish here because I once I start going, I can go for a long time. But I mostly wanted to make the point about difference between the journals that we sort of represent.
Thank you. Thanks, Rafal. That's really interesting. I think sometimes when we are in the lab and we are looking for the journals where to publish. I mean, I talk for myself. When I was doing my PhD, I just followed what my supervisor was telling me to do. But I guess when you are at that stage in your career that you are a postdoc or a young group leader and you want to, define your place in the research field, you really need to be careful with this, which journal you choose. So, Rafal, if I need to ask you to give like 3 tips for the people that are listening to us here today, what would that be? For
sorry, 3 tips for what exactly?
For what to look in a journal. What do you think you need to consider? Anything to be careful of? We heard in another seminar we had about grants that people should be careful to not apply for the same grants at the same time with the same proposal. For example, that's usually the people that are reviewing those might be the same. And so you just don't want to have that kind of, conflict or
I don't think that would happen in publishing necessarily because you're past the stage. One of the underlying principles is that you won't be submitting the same paper to multiple journals at the same time as well. That's like there are some sort of publishing ethics rules that generally I think are probably less known among researchers than among editors, and we treat them very seriously, and people just often don't realize how seriously we treat them. And not submitting a manuscript to multiple journals at the same time is a big one for us because it does waste a lot of editorial time, it does waste a lot of time of reviewers, and the different journals sort of approach it slightly differently when authors are sort of caught red-handed. I don't think that any journal will blacklist anyone for that, but I think that the messaging we'll be getting from editors could be quite scary sometimes, and it's it's easy thing to avoid. But that's probably not actually answering your question, which was about what my 3 tips would be. I don't know. I mean, there are some things that I guess are worth thinking about when choosing the journal, and I appreciate it's very difficult sometimes to figure out what the appropriate outlet would be because there is just a lot of journals. I mean, generally, it's there is something to be said for brand recognition, and that the journals that you know of and you've heard from your colleagues or your peers or your supervisor or collaborators, saying that journal you can trust. That is something that's probably more useful than you trying to do a lot of research among thousands of the journals that are out there. As it happens, that's not necessarily related, a lot of those journals are published by big publishing houses, but that is not to say that there aren't very good quality journals that are published by smaller publishers, by societies, and so on. The one thing that maybe I would sort of caution all of you about, which is sort of quite an extreme example, but I know that a lot of early career researchers in particular just fall prey to the phenomenon, as submitting papers to what is referred to as predatory journals, which you might have heard about that, or maybe not. I don't really know.
Yeah, no. Could you expand a bit more on that?
Yeah, I mean, this is something that has developed as a phenomenon when open access became much bigger thing, and a lot of companies that are, they are based, a lot of them are based in India, I think, but not only. So maybe I shouldn't be sort of pinpointing any particular country as a main culprit. But there are essentially companies that figured out that a way of making money is to pitch to the authors a journal that very often is a fake journal in that it has a facade and it has an appearance of legitimacy, but almost all information that you see on the website that gives it that appearance of legitimacy is essentially false or fabricated, or just a lie. And the way those companies operate, because obviously the principle of open access is that you as an author, you do pay processing charges at acceptance of the paper. These companies will offer very low APC charges. They will solicit submissions from authors by spam emailing everyone. I don't know where they get the emails from, maybe from Scopus, maybe from other databases. They'll invite you to submit papers for journals that are completely not from your area of expertise, and won't, despite promising that the papers is peer reviewed, they won't peer review them. Many of these are not indexed in any sort of self-respecting indexers or indexing databases, and so I think it's important not to fall prey to that, because that can be problematic later on. I mean, at the end of the day, we would hope that research, when your papers are being used for your evaluation as researchers, whether this is going to be part of a thesis or is it going to be part of application for a job or for tenure or whatever, that we would hope that papers are assessed on the merits of the paper. But what we hope and what is happening are two different things, and we know that this is not the case, and that journals are used as proxy for the quality of the paper. And I think that cases of that are known, that papers that were published in those predatory titles are essentially, they are treated as a paper that essentially hasn't happened. It's also problematic for us as journals, because very often when we receive submissions from authors who had papers published in those predatory titles, we actually cannot consider them, because that would be duplicate publication if that paper already exists in the public domain. And those companies, they are essentially, I mean, they are criminal enterprises. There's no doubt about that. And it's actually incredibly difficult to even retract the paper if you wanted to. And authors often struggle. I've seen sort of stories about people who were first asked to pay APCs to publish and then asked to pay more to get paper retracted, when they realized that was all just a scam. So that is something to be sort of cautious about. There is this sort of initiative that's called I think Check Think Submit or Think Check Submit. I don't quite remember, but I'm sure we can find the link and maybe share after the meeting, that essentially sort of explains how to approach looking at the journal sort of website and trying to make up your mind about whether it even looks legitimate, because for a lot of them it's you really can tell. Yeah, I think that's.
Thank you. No, that's really interesting. I wasn't aware of all these scams, I guess. I just wanted to tell everyone, please feel free to add any question. I had one also for Marcia. Both of you touched base a bit on the bad results publication. One of the things that you also mentioned, Marcia, is that one of the things to consider is the novelty of the work that is being done, right? So how does this fit with the bad results?
I think sometimes you would assume, and with clinical trials, sometimes it happens that the drug went through several phases, and you might think it would work in a certain setting, and then it doesn't. And in those cases, the trial is even stopped for futility. It says, this clearly isn't working. The patients are progressively getting more and more sick. So this combination won't work. And this is when it's so important to publish these results. And this is for two reasons. One, and as Rafal has mentioned briefly, and I think this is such an important topic, is duplicate data. I mean, the amount of research that is being duplicated because people don't publish these negative results, it is just, it's not okay, because it's a waste of resources, both, time of the researcher, sometimes animals, sometimes, money. So this is just not okay. And then it's important because there is no point in keeping trying to get something work that clearly doesn't work in a certain setting. And so this is so important. It might be a novel combination, or it might be a novel treatment, and maybe people expected it to work very well, but it didn't. And it might be in a subset of patients, it might be in whatever setting it was given, but it simply doesn't work. And this is really important to publish, even if when the trial didn't work and it was stopped, it's still important, because there is no point in another group trying to do the same thing. And this is why it's so important.
Thank you. Is there any question from the audience? I think I have another one for both of you. So lots, so the cohort from the ENVOLVE program, the researchers that are now in Portugal. So as I told you, they come from the PALOP, the Portuguese-speaking countries in Africa. And one of the things I have been, finding through this community and these seminars is that sometimes, and lots of work that they are doing were in a way or another being redone. So let's say it has been, I don't know, someone has studied breast cancer, some protein or something like that in Europe and the US, and they are now trying to do that in their own countries. How do you see this in terms of publications? Yeah. So they are trying to replicate and see if something, that a methodology, something that has worked for another in another context, if it applies in there. In terms of publication, would this be considered non-novel or maybe not?
It can be considered novel if the patient population is different or it has something different. So we know that there are racial differences, in certain types of cancer, prevalence, incidence, etc. So it can be novel if that's what they're showing. Well, maybe if the proteins or the genes vary in that population, then it can be novel. If it is just repeating the methods to try see if people can be treated in that context, then it would be trickier to publish in a journal like the Lancet, but I'm not sure about other journals if that would be possible.
So I probably have to comment for other journals. So I think generally the underlying principle is always that there should be an original contribution in the paper. Now, the difference in how you look at different papers essentially in how you interpret what original contribution is. And so I think people very often assume that original contribution means that there must be, research must be entirely new, entirely novel, which is sort of, I think, maybe not the best way of looking at this, because that just excludes a lot of research that's confirmatory, which is probably most of research, in fact. So if we get papers that report findings that maybe are known in the field, the sort of things that we might be looking at is are these findings confirmed in a new system? Are they confirmed using orthogonal techniques to what the original paper said? Stuff like that. So you can have papers that essentially report things that in theory have been in the literature before, but they just add more credence to the original finding. And there is something to be said as well for the importance of that, because there are fields where whole subfields have been built on the individual papers that have never been properly replicated in a way that would allow for generalization of the finding. People just assume that it's and I'll grant you this is probably less in life sciences and even less in physical sciences, but in particular in social sciences, the whole thing about the crisis in psychology is built around this problem, that people would have done a study on a very small cohort, which is a very specific population. The number of those studies are just essentially based on a small group of white male educated students in some sort of US college, and that's been later generalized to the whole world, is absolutely astounding. But I think in most fields we just be thinking, what what on earth is happening here? But in psychology, somehow it's managed to fly under the radar for like decades. And there are whole fields that which essentially, stem from like individual papers that never quite have been properly repeated. And now we are discovering that there are phenomena that have been reported in psychology literature and are subject to a lot of like popular psychology books. And I think psychology is particularly prone to producing those popular science books because everyone is an expert on psychology, as we all know. That are based essentially on science that we are slowly discovering is actually completely invalid. So there is value in that, but it very much depends on the framing of the paper, I would say. So that's something to consider when, if you have results that you think, well, I kind of reproduce what's been done elsewhere. You have to think about, what was the knowledge gap, in a sense, that you addressed with the data set, and that might help you figuring out how to frame it. I mean, that's not going to be a Nature paper or Lancet paper, but it should be a paper. If it's a valuable set of data, it should be a paper anyway.
Brilliant, thank you. Is there any questions from the audience?
I can come up with 2 questions. One question would be for both of us to just quickly comment on publication fees, because for scientists based in developing countries in Africa, basically, the fees are going to be a challenge. Sometimes it can be high. Just want to a little bit hear from what your journal are doing, how we approach this question. And the other question I'm going to go for Marcia specifically, because in your slide you mentioned about the Me Too syndrome. Maybe if you can develop a little bit more of this syndrome in this particular context, just for us probably to understand a little better what it means. Thank you.
Would you like to start, Marcia, with that, and I can sort of formulate my reply to the other question in my hand?
Yes, I think regarding the first question, I think it's an excellent question, because so the Lancet, or at least a lot of our journals, now we have completely open access journals, but a lot of our journals used to work in a subscription fashion. So the authors didn't have to pay, and then it would be only the readers that would have a subscription could access the papers. Now with open access, there is indeed fees that you need to pay. And regarding that, I have two comments. One of them is generally the fees are paid by the funding body. So they should have some money allocated for that. And then if not, and if it comes from a low and middle income country, the Lancet can waive the fee, because we do understand that not every country can, or like researchers from certain countries cannot afford to pay. And for us, we want to publish, good science, and we don't want ever that inequality or money is on the way to get that science published. So we have a board that can decide to waive the fee, so that the person can still publish with us. Regarding the second question, I think this is where sometimes there are differences, and I think Rafal has approached this a little bit, where the Me Too syndrome is when we tend not to publish a lot of confirmatory studies. So where maybe 2 groups have shown something and a third group says, oh, we've also observed this. We tend not to publish this as much, but I think that's the Me Too syndrome. It's like, oh, we've also shown this. And that's when, for us, it's a bit trickier to publish, because we, if it's not going to change clinical practice because someone else has showed it, we tend not to publish this sort of study.
Thanks, Marcia. Rafal, anything to add?
Well, I guess I should respond to the question about the money, which is always the thorny topic. So obviously, with us being open access journal as well, that's a big consideration. I think that's generally, I would say, it's true of pretty much most publishers who offer open access titles, that there are APC waiver programs. which they function differently at the different stages for different publishers. So if it's something that you'd need, if you want to submit, I would suggest looking at that before submission. But they are fairly similar in that the research that's coming from researchers from I think usually it's like bottom 20% or something like this of the World Bank list of countries, whatever it's called, essentially have automatically waived APCs, and then going up the list, that sort of proportion changes, but there is opportunity for partial waivers and stuff like that. And most publishers will also have sort of discretionary waivers for researchers who come from countries that technically are higher on the list, but the personal circumstances of the researcher are such that they still can't afford, for example, because they don't have that funding from the funder, or they for whatever other reason might have happened. We have people who left academia are trying to publish their research from their degree or something like that. All sorts of things. So that there is some space for for publishers to be flexible about this. I completely just want to echo what Marcia said, that for editors, when we assess papers, and that doesn't matter what journal we're talking about, whether it's subscription, open access, selected, non-selected, we don't look at the paper as a this is what the profit for the journal is going to be. It's just the editorial decisions are never based on money. And in fact, the way the journals are set up most of the time is such that the publishing side of the journal, which is where the commercial colleagues sort of operate, and editorial side, which has responsibility for selection of content, are very separate, and we don't have those discussions essentially. So even those decisions about waivers is something that I'm not privy to. When I see the paper, I don't know if the authors received waiver for it or not. I don't know what their circumstances are. I only look at the paper as in terms of scientific content. What I would say, as a final note, I guess, is there are also increasingly outlets, publishing outlets that sort of are run by funders, where if you come either from a certain country or you are funded by a certain funder, you can publish open access without a fee completely. And those function in different ways. So I think Wellcome Trust has I think it's called Wellcome Open Research Platform. Gates Foundation has something similar. There's quite a few more these days, but there are also journals that essentially are sponsored by, for example, learned societies. Then the authors don't have to pay APCs, but the readers also don't have to pay to read. Those are often called diamond open access. There is actually surprisingly many of them. They are not as well known because they aren't published by big publishers. But if if this is a sort of money is a factor that prevents you from publication, and you are struggling with getting through with a bigger publishers and their waiver programs, I would definitely suggest looking out for those, because there is hundreds, if not thousands, of those journals. They might not have the same branding as Nature or Lancet or Cell or Science or whatever, but it kind of depends what sort of paper you're trying to publish as well.
Is there a list where we could find those?
Yeah, so there is that is called, I think, the DOAJ, I think. It's like a repository of open access journals. If you guys have other questions, I'll just search for a link and drop it in the chat.
Thank you. Thanks, Elvis.
Yeah, I just, I think it's, as Rafal say, money should never be the barrier to get the research published. And I think all publishers, at least all the big publishers, are extremely committed to equality and inclusion and diversity. I think almost all of them have pledges in terms of, background, race, gender. So I think they all have programs to make sure that everyone can publish with them.
Thank you. Is there Yeah, Cruz.
Thank
Please
you.
go
Thank
ahead.
you both.
Cruz, you
Yeah.
are on mute. Yeah.
Yeah, I have a question for both. There is a specific situation or condition to select reviews. The criteria to select reviews the same for different magazine, or is different to specific? For example, the Lancet or the Nature use the same strategy to select a review?
I don't know. I can explain how we select ours. Generally, we will look at experts in the field. So one platform we use is Scopus, and we just see people who have expertise, so people who have published a lot in the area. And then the other thing we do is we guarantee that they haven't published too much with the authors of the paper. So that avoids that, they might be friends, they might be, have published too much. So even they might have had some input in the work. So we just try to make sure they haven't co-published too much. And obviously then if they accept, they have to say they don't have any conflicts of interest. They haven't, again, to confirm they haven't published too much, or they don't have any grants. Sometimes they have grants in, with the authors, and they say, oh, I might participated a bit in this study, so I cannot do an unbiased review, and so they do that. So it's the two things: it's expertise and to guarantee there is no conflicts of interest when they review our papers. I don't know, Rafal, how you guys do it.
I think the basic principles are the same for most journals. So obviously we search for expertise that is relevant to the paper. And what you often see in terms of like the numbers of reviewers per paper and how their comments differ, and also where a lot of the sort of perceived, that reviewer was super negative and that was very positive, oh my god, what's happening here, where that comes from is essentially that we try to make sure that the combined expertise of reviewers that are looking at the paper sort of covers all the different aspects, technically and scientifically of the paper. And so those sort of contradicting reports that people sometimes see and love to complain about on social media, they stem usually from that, from essentially two reviewers with very different backgrounds who are looking at different aspects of the paper and maybe have different understanding of different parts of the paper. But the general principles, is essentially expertise and ensuring there is no conflicts. I would say that for selective journals, in my experience, but that can differ, I think, for different titles, editors try to find usually someone who's slightly more experienced and maybe have published in a highly selective journal themselves before. The rationale for that is that essentially, if you're going to ask people to help you assess, is this cutting edge enough for this journal, you have to have someone who had that experience and reads that journal often as well, to be able to sort of assess that. That is very subjective assessment for a reviewer and for an editor to make. But if someone has been through the grinder themselves, they will have a better appreciation of what kind of things are expected for the journal. That's slightly less of an issue for us because we are non-selective, so we mostly want people to comment on the technical robustness, analytical robustness, and stuff like that. So more specialized referees for us are fine. We also potentially ask sort of more junior researchers a bit more, although I'm not necessarily convinced that that's very different. The expectation is that people who we invite to review have some experience, and there is, there are limited ways that we as editors can assess what someone's experience is. Unless you know someone personally, which sometimes you do, but how often does that happen? It's not very common at the end of the day. The alternative is us using proxies, and one of the proxies is essentially publication record. So that people will use different thresholds for what they will consider sufficient number of publications on the topic to be able to say with some certainty that this person probably knows what they are talking when they talk about the specific subject. But there has to be some publication record there, which is why people tend to not invite, for example, PhD students all that much. There are some exceptions to that. Again, if you know someone personally who works on some very specific technique, for example, where you need expertise, those exceptions can be made. But most of the time, because as I said, we use databases and we use a lot of sort of mental shortcuts to decide who appears to be most appropriate for the paper.
And I guess PhD students don't show up on the top of that list.
Well, yeah, quite.
Because...
I mean, you can't find a potential referee in the databases based on authorship if the person wasn't published.
Yeah. Thank you. There we have another question. Thanks, Cruz. Thanks for the question. We have another one from Emilia.
Good afternoon, and thank you for the presentation. There are some journals where they don't have enough reviewers, and when the author submits their paper, they ask them to send at least 3 reviewers. What happens? Does it happen in your journals? Thank you.
Thanks, Emilia. Marcia, would you like to go first?
No, we don't ask for reviewers.
I already see it coming from the nodding. I think you'll find that journals that have professional manuscript handling editors don't do this very often, because you just have editors who are being paid to find reviewers who are appropriate. It happens more on the journals with academic editors, and it's not necessarily a bad thing for the authors to be able to have this opportunity to point out experts who you feel might be relevant to your paper. I think we don't ask for it as something that must be done. I know that there are journals who essentially say, you must do this or you want progressive submission. We tell people that they can offer suggestions. Our academic editors can then use those suggestions, provided that the people who are suggested are actually appropriate in terms of expertise, and that they don't have conflicts of interest, which we check through effectively looking for potential co-publications as yet another proxy that we have for what conflict of interest can manifest itself as. So if you have an option of doing that, I would definitely recommend using it. If you're going to do this, I would definitely recommend not listing your closest collaborators, because they'll pretty much be immediately scratched off the list. I think there are two most common mistakes when people have option of suggesting reviewers are suggesting people they work with who are immediately just excluded based on publications, or suggesting people who are like the biggest names in the field who won't even have time to open that invitation email, not to speak about actually agreeing to review and reviewing the paper. So I think finding people who work in the field on similar topics, who maybe aren't your closest competitors either, because you probably want to avoid those for obvious reasons, and suggesting them, that can be a good option that sometimes can speed up peer review process. But yeah, I mean, I don't know. I hope that kind of answers that question a bit.
I was going to say, Rafal, for us, I have received letters to say, oh, please don't invite these people because these are our direct competitors, but not with suggestion. And I think it's because of that, because we are worried that if people suggest reviewers, it might be that, they have like a personal relationship or they know them, and we are a bit worried.
Well, I think that's something to maybe expand on that most journals, they might not ask for or offer option of offering suggestions, but pretty much all journals I know of will give you an option of excluding a certain number, reasonable. So let's, I mean, I have seen papers saying, please don't invite anyone from this country. It's not something that we can in any meaningful way respect as a request. But if you have usually that's like 2 or 3 names or labs that are your close competitors that you'd rather, not review your paper, that's normally something that editors respect, as long as it doesn't completely hamper peer review process, which, very rare circumstances, if you have like 2 labs in the world that work on some problem, then obviously excluding the other lab would essentially make peer review impossible. But those are not common cases, obviously. But yeah, I mean, there's always option to say, yeah, that person I'd rather not invite. I would say though that whenever we see authors complaining about reviewers saying, I'm sure you invited the person who I excluded explicitly, it never is that person. And half of the time is going to be someone they suggested as well. So that's, I think authors need to learn not to read much into, the content of the reports and trying to interpret who might have made those comments, because guesswork is just going to be guesswork.
Sometimes you do see that of the reviewers saying, oh, you should read this paper and perhaps use it for your reference, right? So that's quite an interesting one. I don't know if there is any more questions. It's 6 p.m. I just wanted to ask the two speakers if you are okay to stay 10 more minutes. So we have one final question and we wrap up. Yeah?
Yep.
Krush, you had a question, right?
Yeah. When we submit a manuscript, we should send the cover letter. What's the impact of cover letter in terms of decision, the outcome of my manuscript, if it will be accepted or rejected? What's the impact of cover letter?
I think the cover letter is very important, because if it's the first thing that the editor will read, and it should give an overview about the importance or the novelty, of your paper.
Yes, I say this. I talk about this because the review don't have access to the cover letter. Sometimes the review don't have access to the cover letter. And when I send my manuscript, I give the explanation, the more reason to apply to that journal. And the review don't have access to this cover letter. And this could affect the decision about my manuscript, about the way he see my result. How did this could affect the outcome?
The cover letter is important for the editor that will assess the paper, and the paper will go to the reviewers if the editor doesn't think the work is novel or is worth to publish in the journal. So the cover letter is important for the editor to say, oh, should I publish this? Should I give this a chance? Or oh, I'm not going to waste my time reading the paper. So this is why it's so important. And the other advice is it should be very clear in your paper, in a panel or in the introduction, why your results are so important, or in your conclusions. It should be very, very clear what's the novelty, what's your hypothesis, how this, can either change or, improve the field, or they should be very clear in the manuscript as well. But the cover letter is the first thing that the editor sees. And then the editor decides, oh, I'll read this paper, I sort of know the topic or not. And that's why it's important to explain first to the editor, but I strongly advise the paper is clear as well. Why the results are important.
Rafal, would you like to add? Yeah, anything? Yeah.
I was again laughing because I think cover letters are one of those areas of sort of where editors tend to just like Marmite, either love it or hate it, essentially. And I think they, the purpose they serve, it really depends on the journal. Again, if you're trying to get into selective publication where the editor needs to understand the implications of your work and the significance of your work, that cover letter is going to be crucial. For journals that are not selecting based on those perceived criteria, that cover letter is essentially window dressing. The submission system will force you to provide one anyway, because no one has managed to figure out how to build a submission system that doesn't ask for cover letter yet. But for some journals, for us, if you just said, here's my paper, I hope you review it, that probably would be enough. There's obviously a place as well where you can list all those suggestions of reviewers or who you want to exclude or stuff like that. but I think, you know, depending on the journal, that the importance of that is slightly different. Regardless, I think, of how significant the findings are, I think it is a good place to like put the paper in a bit more context. So, you know, if you have a study that just, you know, that idea originated from somewhere, I don't know, maybe you've seen something recently published, you know, that was amazing, and you'll figure out a way to build on that. Maybe you've done a study yourself and it's a follow-up. Maybe you know of something that's been recently published that sort of puts your study in like very specific context. I think a short paragraph, you know, literally 2 or 3 sentences in the cover letter explaining that can really help editors to sort of contextualize your paper quickly. Again, regardless of whether we're talking about journals that are selective or non-selective.
Brilliant. Thanks.
That's a great point. Be short and concise.
Yeah.
We receive a lot of manuscripts. We don't want to spend like an hour trying to understand the letter. Short and concise, yes.
Thank you. Thanks, Marcia. So I'm just conscious of the time. If there is no more questions, I would like to wrap up, and thank you both very, very much for the great discussion and the presentation, and to all of you for joining us, and obviously to Carlos Gulbenkian and Sophia here to join us from Carlos Gulbenkian for the support in our activities. As a final thought, there is another event coming up next Thursday at the same time, and we will be talking about careers. So we have some postdocs and some group leaders that will be sharing with you their career journey. Thank you all very much.
Thank